Okay, here goes. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. In this all things Middle East, West Asia episode, all things historic Palestine and Lebanon, and hopefully eco-socialism, depending how much time we have, we welcome back to the program Rania Masri. Rania Masri is a Lebanese-American who has been a long-time university teacher in environmental studies. She is a lifelong anti-imperialist activist and speaker, an eco-socialist, and all-around eco-justice and social racial justice comrade and ally. And let's get into it because got so many questions that I want to ask her. But first off, Rania, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Always honored to have you back on the program, Rania. And also, folks, don't forget to share One Plus One's content, past and present, our playlists, and more. Facebook has been creating many hurdles and prevents me from sharing widely my content, so it's highly important that viewers share widely One Plus One's content. Otherwise, we might have to discontinue it. And also share us widely because it helps us overcome the far-right algorithms and the monopoly that corporate and Western state media has on us. And also, don't forget to donate and donate generously if you can. And now on to the topic at hand. So, Rania, such an honor to have you back on the program, although it's very tragic what's going on, and of course one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on was to talk about Palestine. But before we talk about Palestine, because I know we're going to be talking a lot about Palestine and settler colonialism and so forth, I just wanted to briefly ask you, though, what do you think it's going to take in the U.S. specifically for the U.S., its workers' rights, its feminists, its queer liberation, its black leftists, Latinx leftists, anti-imperialists, and the workers' right movement, and even Palestine justice folk to show more urgent solidarity to Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans? I'm very curious your response to that before we talk about historic Palestine and Lebanon.
Yeah, that's a really big question. It's a really big question. And the first few things that immediately come to my mind is, well, does the left in the United States, of which I consider myself, of course, to be part of, have we been successful in building an imagination? And by an imagination, what I mean is, have we made it clear to others all across the spectrum in the United States that this is what socialism is? This is what socialism feels like. This is what socialism can create. Have we been able to present an imagination of a possibility? And I would argue we haven't. The possibility that arises in people's minds isn't socialism. The possibility that arises in people's minds is more to the right and more to the right. And there's numerous reasons I would argue this, but that becomes a big challenge. Another big challenge is, have we been successful in organizing versus mobilizing? So for the past decades, I mean, I remember in 2003 when we managed to get millions around the world to protest against a war before it began. This was February 2003 when the US was going to be invading Iraq, and people protested around the world in the millions. And there were some that actually thought that if we protest, the policy will change. That all it takes is a large, massive, performative protest. If that were the case, it would be wonderful, but that's not the case. But what happened since then, and that was 2003 was just one example, where we showed ourselves to be effective in mobilizing. We can get people into the room, but we have not been effective in organizing. And there is a really big difference between the two. And so I would start there and saying, well, do we have a workers' rights movement in the United States? Do we have an anti-imperialist movement in the United States? Do we have a movement of the left, a real movement of the left in the United States? And I would argue we don't. We have leftist organizers, we have workers' organizers, we have unions, we have those things. But I'm not sure we've reached the case where it's a hurricane, it's a tsunami of energy. We're not there yet. And I'll just give you one example of why I say we're not there yet. You look at the last national elections between an individual who represented the prison industrial complex, an individual who did not win any election, who got the nomination to the Democratic Party, basically, we know how she got it, okay? And between her and between a felon, a convicted felon, okay, the majority of people actually chose not to vote. So when we see who actually voted in the last election, we see there was a decline in the number of Democratic voters. And there wasn't real a massive increase in the Republican voters. So Trump won the presidency because of the failure of the Democrats and because of the failure of the presentation of an alternative. And I say this as a member of the Green Party. You know, we were not successful in being able to get those people to vote Green, even though Green does represent the values of the majority of Americans. The Green Party really does represent the values of the majority. But yet people didn't go out to vote. So people were not even able to do that kind of imagining. Imagine what it would take to have individuals in the United States to acknowledge and to recognize that the United States still is a settler colony. And I say that because, well, one, there hasn't been one defensive war this country has done, not one. And people need to understand what that means then when we elevate military and we elevate veterans. Not one defensive
Yeah.
war has
Yeah.
the United States done, although the United States has been at war for 92% of its history. So then just that
Hey,
examination, okay. I mean,
just like its friend Israel.
that's huge. That's huge. Okay, so then and we can also acknowledge that, okay, I argue that the United States is still a settler colony because the United States is still violating the treaties that it had signed under duress, under false pretenses, but nevertheless had signed with First Nation communities in the United States, and it is still violating them. The very first community upon whose land we have oil pipelines in the United States is the First Nation communities throughout the United States. So until we recognize that first portion, that we are still a settler colony, and therefore we need to be acknowledging and paying reparations to the First Nation communities, and of course paying reparations to all the millions of African bodies who were stolen under slavery and who continue to be stolen in the prison industrial complex because slavery is still legal in US prisons, according to the 13th Amendment. Small little point.
Yeah.
We have a while to go. We have a while to go. We've seen important coalitions being built. We've seen in North Carolina how we have the unity in some cases between First Nation communities who are arguing for environmental justice and other environmental justice organizations, and they come together. We've been seeing that. We saw that much, much earlier, excuse me, with the fight for water rights that happened like more than 10 years ago. We've been seeing that, but it is a process, and we're nowhere near it. And when we think that right now, without exaggeration, I'm not using words to be inflammatory. Right now, the United States is a police state. And I say this because the largest so-called police force has the budget that it has a budget larger than many countries' militaries. And this largest police force, quote unquote, is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE.
Yeah.
ICE does not operate under the judicial branch in the United States. It operates under the executive branch in the United States. So ICE is now kidnapping individuals, documented, undocumented, and citizen. It's kidnapping a range of individuals. It's putting them in detention facilities, in concentration camps, and deporting them overseas to El Salvador, to Uganda, to South Sudan, without due process. Without due process. The moment we have a governmental agency operating without due process, that means there is no longer due process for anyone in the United States. So what does that mean when the United States becomes a police state? That's what we have right now. The United States right now is operating in very much the same form that Jill Stein had expected, and that other political analysts and leftist thinkers had known, which is this is the late stage of capitalism. Now the government is being dissolved by the billionaires. Itself, the government is being dissolved. The United States is doing to itself what it had the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank do to many other countries around the world. Now that is happening to itself in the United States. In the midst of this crisis, How are we going to organize? How are we going to step forward? And I say this as somebody who's been organizing in the United States. I hope that we can be able to show an imagination beyond individualism, beyond fear, beyond capitalism, beyond fascism. So people recognize that for the majority of our lives as human beings, we did not live this way. For
Yeah.
the majority of our lives, we shared. We lived in abundance. We lived in community. We lived with kindness. We lived with humility. And this is the imagination that we want to be projecting forward so we can work to build it. So that's my long answer to your question.
Well, very interesting response, and I'll just end it and segue it by saying I believe the late John Pilger, who I know you're also quite a big admirer.
Yes, yes,
He once often said about his home country of Australia, a settler colonial country, also an aggressive
yes.
imperial country, that until we give back the first people, the Aboriginal people, until we give back their nationhood, we can never claim our own. And I think that's a perfect segue actually to this question.
Mhm.
Palestine. First, tell me overall your reflections on what's been happening the past roughly 2 years of Israel's genocidal slaughter in Gaza. And can you also push back against the constant need and I think we on the left, the non-Palestinian left, we often do this of presenting of feeling the constant need of presenting Palestinians as this perfect victim. And my only follow-up question would be that while it's easy to fall into despair and cynicism over Palestine, I'm curious what over the past 2 years has given you some hope regarding what Israel's doing and the the sort of tsunami of humanity and compassion that we see people displaying towards Palestine in the form of protests and whatnots.
So there's layers within that question. I'm going to start with the first one. Um, those of us who'd been following what the Zionist entity and what Zionists and Israelis and Jewish supremacists had been saying for decades, um, even though I knew what they were saying, it still is hard to have imagined this level of horror
Yeah.
and this level of impunity. I mean, 100 people being killed every day. There, if if we go to a funeral for a child every single day of our lives, it would take us 52 years. And we're just talking about children who've been killed. So
Wow.
if we just take a pause with that, imagine, and now we're not even talking about children whose limbs have been amputated. Gaza has become the area with the highest proportion of children with amputations. Um, it is horrific. It is every level of horror without exception. There is not one crime that the Zionists have not done and celebrated and celebrated. And for me, when I look at where we are today, I ask myself what led us to come to this position where we have seen for almost 2 years the live stream genocide. It's live streamed. It's a Holocaust that we see on our phones and we swipe and we swipe, we share, we comment and we swipe and then we turn it down and we go on with our lives. That normalization of horror that it is quite heavy.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we are here not just because of Zionism, but also because of all those liberals who for decades were normalizing relationships with Zionists. All those liberals who continue to ask of Palestinians to compromise. Every single liberal who, whenever a Palestinian would be present, would ask to hear from the other side. And we need to have both sides presented. And we need to have, quote, neutrality. All of them are just as guilty. All of them are just as guilty as Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and General Electric and Chevron and the New York Times and BBC and Associated Press and Reuters and the US Democratic Party and the US Republican Party and the German government and the French government and the Canadian government and the British government and the Australian government and the European Union and on and on and on and on. Everyone is guilty. It is horrific. I mean, there's no words that I can say that do justice to the horror that we are witnessing in Gaza. Absolutely no words that can do justice. And it's I'm glad you brought up the perfect victim because last week there was this uproar in social media. This uproar because Haaretz published, I'm going to read, what Haaretz said. It said that a classified IDF report
Hmm.
says it could only verify 17% of those killed in Gaza as combatants. In other words, the headline went out, 83% of the Palestinians killed in Gaza were civilians.
Yeah.
That number, 83% were civilians. And I'm going, hold on a second. Hold on a second. Every single, without exception, man, woman, and child in Gaza is innocent. It makes no difference if they carried a gun or if they carried a pen or if they carried a stethoscope or if they farmed. It makes no difference what their gender or their age is. They are all innocent. This presentation that we only mourn our women and children is not only a disgrace against our men, but it is also this presentation that Palestinians can only be mourned if they behave in a certain way, if they behave with civility, if they behave with decorum, and if they behave through nonviolence. And I find it really fascinating for the liberals, by the way, that
Hmm.
we, the colonized, have to constantly argue our humanity while they don't. We, the colonized, have to constantly watch our voice, not be too angry, not be too black, not be too brown. We have to tone our appearance down. We have to constantly present ourselves as non-violent, constantly bring up the stories, constantly humanize ourselves. What horror. I'm not going to human. I am a human. And if the colonizer cannot see my intrinsic humanity, that is on them. That is not on me to prove. While, by the way, the colonizer uses military force all the time, and we don't deny the colonizer's humanity because of their use of military force. But for us, the colonized, if we dare to fulfill our obligation to our country and our obligation to international law by supporting armed resistance, then suddenly our humanity is taken away from us by the media and suddenly our slaughter becomes acceptable. If folks cannot see the hypocrisy in there, it is too much. So every death in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank is a murder and is an assault and is a tragedy and is to be mourned and is to be protested against. So I will not be uplifting, that yes, 83% of the Palestinians killed in Gaza, according to the Israeli military itself, are civilians. Yes, this is
Well,
this, this is a horrific number that demonstrates. But for God's sakes, the Israelis and the Zionists had been saying for decades that they want to kill every child. They themselves have been saying that they want to bring an apocalypse to Gaza. So why should we act surprised when they fulfill the very promise that they have been making and that they continue to make? So it stuns me. Like we don't believe them when they say this. We don't believe them when they themselves acknowledge that they're racist. We don't believe them when the latest poll, time and time again, shows that 82% of Israelis back the expulsion of Palestinians in Gaza, that the vast majority of Israelis support the rape and torture of Palestinians, that the vast majority of Israelis support the Jewish supremacy that their state, their entity is built on and want to maintain it. And we're supposed to ignore that? So no.
yeah, no,
There isn't a perfect victim, but what is clear is that Israel has demonstrated itself to be apartheid beyond anything South Africa and the racist apartheid regime in South Africa was able to manufacture and be more supremacist than anything that Hitler's Nazi party was able to manufacture in Germany. Israel really is the peak of European and United States supremacy. It is present in Israel, that kind of racist colonialist supremacy.
I didn't have this question typed down, but I have to ask this follow-up question, which is, uh, I'm not gonna reveal the identity of this person, but I was arguing with a friend of mine who claims is is for Palestinian liberation and so forth like that.
Mhm.
But this friend of mine often takes issue with me when I have a certain tone about Israel. When I call out is when because I mean I used to describe Israel as a Jewish supremacist state. It is, but now I'm much
It
more
is.
comfortable to just call out to just say that Zionism is a hideous ideology. It's a disgusting ideology that needs to be eradicated. And a lot of my friends sometimes get very, very, upset with me when I have that tone and so forth. But and yet these people claim that they're for Palestinian liberation, and isn't that and don't you think that's the very reason why we're in the sort of mess we're in is that you have people who claim they're for Palestine liberation, but they're very quiet about it and only talk about it within the
What is what does liberation look like to them? I mean, that's what I always want to know. Those who defend Zionism, what does my people's liberation look like to them? Do they think of it as they will grant us rights? That our rights are something that need to be given to us by them? And if so, then they have no concept of what a right is, nor what liberation is. How do they envision it? Do they envision liberation to be, oh, we will grant you a state on 22% of your historic land, while we continue to impose Jewish supremacy on the majority of your historic land, but we'll grant you this space and you can have your Palestinian state, but no military. No, 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 no military, of course, because you cannot have a military. And what other limitations will they impose on us? All under the rubrics of Palestinian liberation. What does liberty mean to them? And why does our liberty look different than any other people's liberty? And when I say people, I'm going to be very clear here. There is no such thing as the Jewish people. Let us be very clear about that. There is no such thing as the Christian people. There is no such thing as the Muslim people. These are religions. Religions one can convert into and convert out of. And because of that, you cannot consider them to be a people. They are a religion. You can call them religious communities, but they are not a people. They are not an ethnicity. They are not that kind of group. And we're not even talking about the history of Judaism and the way that there have been mass conversions into Judaism. They cannot trace ethnicity. And we're not even getting to that. For me, it is very simple. A religion cannot be a people. Simple. So long as there is convergence in and out of a religion, then you cannot consider them to be a people. So I want to push back on this concept of the Jewish people.
The
What
Jewish
would it
people
make
who have been
sense? Would it, what?
the Jewish people who are the original indigenous people who got kicked out by these Muslim, Arabic,
And
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 people,
have
and
and have
ergo they have the
Ukrainian
right to reclaim all of their land back because of legitimate grievances. The Holocaust is a very legitimate grievances, but to displace the indigenous Palestinian people as a way to pay back for the crimes of the Holocaust and past, crimes that
well,
other
well, Zionism was born before the Holocaust. Zionism was an older ideology than the Holocaust, and Zionism was supported first and foremost by European anti-Jews, by those in European leadership who did not like Jews, who wanted the Jews to go elsewhere, and then said, "Oh, wow, now we can use them as an armed force to continue with imperialism." Let us be very, very clear about that. As I said in a talk recently, Zionism is a settler colonial, racist, supremacist ideology built upon the eradication of a people native to a land, my people's land. Israel was created by anti-Jewish Europeans and funded by another racist settler colonial state, the United States, which wanted and continues to want an armed colony in the region, and now is being supported and propped up by the European Union and other imperial capitalists. This is what it is. It is the heart of the anti-imperial struggle in the world today, and I would argue it's also the heart of the anti-capitalist struggle in the world today. It is right there. So if anybody wants to diverge those and think about a Zionist state alongside a Palestinian state, then that would be akin to arguing in the United States, can't we have Jim Crow segregation in one place and have, non-Jim Crow segregation in another? Why do you want to have equal rights everywhere? Can't you just have equal rights in one place? You really want to impose justice everywhere throughout the land? So it's
that is quite amazing how if like it would be, well, I mean, I think it is considered to be fringe and unspeakable that black nationalists would be like, we want our own black state in the United States, or we should give up this amount of land back to Mexico, which was stolen from the United States. And a lot of those liberals, because it is very much a liberal ideology, their response to the grievances of those sorts of nationalists is that we're all one people. We're all American. We should all just be getting along. You don't need like your own separate states or anything like that. And yet,
yeah,
that's exactly what we're asking.
but we're not asking it. I mean, Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization originally had asked for one state for all. The Palestinian demand had been very clear: one state for all. If you Europeans want to live on our land and you want to live with inequality and humility with the rest of us, ahla wa sahla. You live with us, and as an immigrant lives in the United States.
Yeah.
I think we're frozen.
Uh-oh. Yes, we are frozen, but I can still hear you. Uh-oh. Wait, one moment. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. Okay. We're back.
We're frozen. Okay. So what I'm saying is I think it's important to recognize that the Palestinian Liberation Organization back in the 60s had proposed one state for all, was proposing equal rights for all. So this idea that we want a separate state, we want all our land.
Wait,
and we want
so even the whole idea of a democratic, secular one-state solution, that was
proposed by the PLO originally. That was the original proposition by the PLO. And it was rejected, of course, by Zionists. We were saying we are willing to live with you under equality, not under subservience, with justice for all. We are willing to do that. It was rejected by the Zionists, and it continues to be. Now the question is, can we live with them? Is it even possible for Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians to live alongside people who celebrate our massacres, parents who teach their children to stand in the way of aid trucks, parents who take their children to watch the bombardment of Gaza and celebrate? The level of sadism that is present in popular Israeli society is unbelievable. And just read the Hebrew press. Read what they say about themselves. It is truly another dimension. So now the question is, can we ever live alongside people who celebrate our genocide? They celebrate it. They revel in it. They only complain about how exhausting killing us is for them. That is their only complaint. How tired they are after they destroy our homes and our fields. You have these Israelis who play games with where they're going to shoot our children, whether in the head or in the stomach or in the groin. It is unbelievable. So the question is, can we ever live alongside such psychopaths? And Israel truly is a society of imported psychopaths.
You know what? Hold that thought, because I actually do want to ask you a question about that on if that's even possible, given the disgusting Holocaust Israel has been inflicting, and not even just on the people of Gaza, but also
in the West Bank, also in Ramallah, also in Jenin, also in Nablus. What they have done to Syria, what they are doing to Lebanon, it is ongoing. They're open demands for a greater Israel. They're openly saying they want to expand. They have a lot to prove to the world that they are actually people with morals. And as of yet, they have shown themselves to be quite the contrary.
But let me ask this question. I'm even annoyed at myself that I have to ask this question, but the stupid journalism rules of objectivity, let me ask you this question then. Now, do you think, given the horrors that we are still seeing Israel do to the people of Gaza, but also those in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that overall it was counterproductive of Hamas or any Palestinian group to have launched the attack it did on October the 7th, especially given the allegations that Netanyahu used the attacks to distract distract people from his petty corruption scandals and his far-right coalition government's very unpopular attacks on the judiciary and its efforts to weaken the high court in Israel, as well as the very socially regressive agenda of Likud's far-right coalition, and many fearing, equality and legal protections of women and the queer community will be weakened or tossed out, that this unprecedented mass protest nationwide in Israel, the October 7th attacks, united the Zionist entity, because that's what unites Israel, is settler colonialism and lighting the region and world on fire. I'm curious your response. I'm very curious your.
So basically, October 7th, the resistance from the Palestinian factions in Gaza is to be held responsible to the genocide that Israel is committing against the Palestinians.
I wouldn't frame it like that, but sure.
That's basically, should we look and say, oh, perhaps had there not been an October 7th, there might not have been, an ongoing Holocaust against the Palestinians in Gaza. And I would say just read what the Israelis themselves have been saying for decades. As Susan Abu Hawa powerfully presented in a talk that she gave recently, the one regret that the majority of Israelis have in Israel is that in 1948 they weren't able to kill us all. And they have been aching to continue with that genocide, that, to continue with the completion of their ethnic cleansing. I hate the term ethnic cleansing. Yeah. Ethnicity is not something to be cleansed, But they've been wanting to do that. And if we notice that the comments made by Israelis, both in their so-called intellectuals, their politicians, their media, mainstream. I'm not talking right-wing as people like to, oh, this is the fringe element, but all across, the Israeli society, they had been setting the stages for this genocide. They had been talking about it. They had been increasing the attacks against Gaza and pushing that. So had there not been an October 7th, they would have created another excuse to have this Holocaust that they have been imposing on Palestinians in Gaza. They would have created another excuse. I also find it deeply problematic for those of us not living under military occupation, for those of us not living under the horror of military occupation and settler colonialism, to sit afar and to make judgments over armed resistance and strategies of armed resistance and what is a good, effective policy and what isn't.
That goes back to that whole perfect victim thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've said this earlier and I'll say this again. October 7th demonstrated an ingenuity of the Palestinian factions. It demonstrated a bravery. It demonstrated particular elements. I mean, look, until now, Palestinians in Gaza are still fighting. Until now. Last week, there was an amazing act of resistance, military action that was conducted by Palestinian factions in Gaza.
Oh, wow. We don't even hear about this. And that includes...
We don't hear about this, but I'm sure all your listeners are aware of the heroism of Yahya Sinwar, of this man who had gone hungry for days and who was fighting alongside his comrades. The leader was fighting alongside his comrades, in Gaza, and who was targeted by drone after drone, one of these quadcopters, who continued to fight with just one arm. I mean, the stories are beyond heroic. They remind me of the stories of Lebanese fighters in 2006, the stories that we've heard of them again this past year and last year. There is a heroism. They remind me of the stories of the Vietnamese who fought against, the U.S. horror in Vietnam. Somebody said that the colonizer only knows how to kill, while those who fight for their land know how to die. And what I'm saying is they know how to die in the sense that for people fighting for their land, they are willing to die for the land, while the colonizer is only willing to kill because all they are doing is stealing. They are not holding on, they are simply stealing. Susan Abu Hawa also reminds us that the Zionists are envious of us. They are envious of Palestinian history, envious of Palestinian roots, envious of Palestinian culture, Palestinian cuisine, Palestinian heritage. They try to steal it all because they have nothing. They have nothing. It's really, and they claim to love the land. How could you possibly love this land that they claim is promised to them because they have transformed the divine into a real estate agent? How can they possibly claim to love a land while destroying its olive trees, while pouring cement into water wells? How? What kind of love is that? What kind of, it's not love. It's not love. It is the hunger of a thief, an empty thief who has nothing and who's trying to fill his belly with an identity that he is still trying to create. You know,
Then a quick so the quick follow up then I have to ask is that is I guess you probably share my opinion that okay, even if Netanyahu wasn't using October 7th as a way to escape from his stupid petty corruption scandals and
Mhm.
entrenching the far right the far right Israel, or isn't it all far right really?
It's all far right. Yeah.
So even if that had not happened, Israel would have still done what it's doing to the people of Gaza, and the fact of the matter is that the Palestinians have been living under a monstrous embargo, siege, whatever you want to call it, ever since the Palestinians had the audacity to vote for Hamas as an alternative representative to Fatah. So that it really doesn't matter what what happened on October the 7th. Israel would have continued to have committed its Holocaust, and Netanyahu was already emboldened to even say that we want to completely annex the West Bank and so forth. Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it may or may not have happened in this particular way. But this presentation that, oh, Israel is crippled by Netanyahu, as if Netanyahu has not been supported by the vast majority of Israelis. And if we look at the recent protests that happened when Israelis protested last week in mass, they were not protesting against the killing of Palestinians. They were not protesting against the starvation that their governments and their media have imposed upon Palestinians in Gaza. They were not protesting against the torture camps that they have set up for Palestinian doctors and healthcare workers who have been kidnapped from Gaza. That was not their protest. They were protesting for their own soldiers. They were protesting for their own hostages. I mean, and we got to stop this because of what it has inflicted upon them. It's another act of supremacy. It's like in the United States. Are we opposed to war because of what it does to the US soldier? Or are we opposed to war because of the napalm bombs that were dropped on the Vietnamese? And if you watch US media and you follow Hollywood, the examination is, oh, look at what the Vietnam War did to the US soldier and look at how they've suffered from PTSD. And who is
Wow.
absent are the
Exactly.
Vietnamese. And that's the same thing that the Israelis have projected. They released a movie several years ago called Bashir, talking about how the horror of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon caused the Israelis who were invading Lebanon. And the New York Times yesterday had an article talking about how the genocide, this wasn't their language, this is my language, but basically how the genocide that the Israelis are imposing on Gaza is tiring the Israeli soldiers. That was their emphasis. Imagine we are an appendage to their pain. It's
And
yeah,
then and
yeah,
then and then when we talk about the whole perfect victim, I brought this up with I brought this up with my friend Joe Emmersberger, a really great media critic, NGO critic, and anti-imperialist campaigner who's been unapologetically outspoken on Israel, calls Israel Nazi Israel all the time on Twitter.
what
And
it is, yeah.
I asked him this question, which I'm about to ask you, because it goes back to that whole problem of the whole
Mhm.
perfect victim. If the attack on October the 7th by Palestinian resistance wasn't done by Hamas, an Islamic, conservative organization. But if it was done by a secular left-wing Palestinian organization, would those of us on the left who also fall into that trap of condemning what happened on October the 7th, but then say that we don't want a genocide of the Palestinians, do you think that the left also is engaged in that kind of perfect victim when we condemn what Hamas is doing? Because I always wonder if this was like a secular Palestinian resistance group that did the attack on October the 7th, would we actually be condemning them, or would we actually be applauding them? I'm curious your
I'm going to break up how you're defining the we, because the left is not one homogeneous body. There have been numerous very loud leftist intellectuals and leftist organizers who have refused to condemn Hamas. I mean, Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, refuses to condemn Hamas for October 7th. So let's be clear, the left is not like one entity here. Okay.
Exactly.
And so recognizing that, then when we look at who actually committed the October 7th act, it wasn't just Hamas. It was a multitude of Palestinian factions. And it was this coalition of Palestinian factions. And this is really important to acknowledge, that while there may be political disagreements between the Palestinian factions, when it comes to armed resistance, they are pretty much in Gaza shoulder to shoulder, So I don't know exactly how many of them were members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the leftist secular group, but it becomes irrespective, And from a leftist perspective, any condemnation of armed resistance is just hollow. It doesn't work that way. And I would encourage anyone who claims to be a leftist and who condemns armed resistance by an occupied population against their colonizer, just to reread Frantz Fanon. And to really read him, not the cliff notes, to really read him, and to see, to read Marx if they don't want to go as far as Frantz Fanon. Read Malcolm X, read our own writers, read Ghassan Kanafani, and understand.
Wait 1 second, Rania. Sorry, having some internet problems. Okay, I think it's working again. Yeah, Rania, go ahead. Say what you were saying.
I was just saying that for anyone who claims to be a leftist and is standing against armed resistance committed by an occupied population against their colonizer, I would encourage them to read Frantz Fanon, to read Malcolm X, to read Ghassan Kanafani, and to ask themselves, truly ask themselves, what routes are permissible in the pursuit of liberty? What pathways do they find to be acceptable for an occupied population? And what pathways do they find not to be acceptable? And why is that the case? And do they apply those same standards to all people around the world? And just to have that kind of self-examination at this stage right now. And I have always rejected speaking across the political line. I've always rejected trying to convince the liberal and the Zionist. That's not my position. And I would say right now, after almost 2 years of a televised Holocaust, if people still have not seen the horror of what Zionism is, if people still have not seen that Zionism as an ideology needs to be thrown into the dustbin, just like Nazism was thrown, if people still have not seen that we need military protection in Gaza, we need a military force protecting the Palestinians in Gaza, a military force protecting Palestinians in the West Bank. If people have not yet come to that conclusion, then they are simply, without apology, racist.
And couldn't agree with you more. And that's actually a perfect segue to this question about Lebanon. Now, very briefly, before we talk about Israel's attacks on Lebanon, how is Lebanon faring since the port blast, which is still an ongoing investigation into it, as well as Israeli terrorism in all of the country, but specifically in southern Lebanon? I'm curious your response.
Not well. The short answer.
Yeah.
Not well. I mean, in addition to the horrors that you presented in terms of the port explosion, which was arguably the largest non-nuclear explosion in the world, in addition to the ongoing acts of terrorism, truly, legally speaking, acts of terrorism committed by the Israeli army that are ongoing, that began just recently with the pager attacks and continued. In addition to all of these, let us remember that Lebanon since 2019 has faced economic and financial bankruptcy. So, in addition to the destruction of its infrastructure from these military acts, there also is the destruction of its infrastructure due to the economic and financial bankruptcy. And so then how is Lebanon faring? Not well, not well. And the only people in Lebanon who are faring well are people who have the financial means to create a kind of bubble around themselves, the financial means to set up their own solar power, to have their own generator, to have their own, their own way of life, which means these are the individuals who are receiving money in US dollars and not the individuals who are receiving salaries in Lebanese currency. So the divide between the rich and the poor has only grown in Lebanon. So yes, Lebanon is not faring well. And if we add on to that, of course, the other element, which is that now Lebanon is represented by a so-called president and prime minister, the president and the prime minister who do not represent the interest of the country in any way, shape, or form, who do not even care to pretend to represent the dignity of the people, then Lebanon is faring even worse.
And year 2 into the Gaza genocide, Israel attacked your country, always under the auspicities of taking out Hezbollah terrorism. But an attack on Hezbollah is really an attack on all Lebanese people. Israel engaged in bombing and collective punishment, against Lebanon. And I would also argue against people who are apologists for Israel that even if Palestinians commit acts of terrorism or a Lebanese group like Hezbollah, in its response to Israeli crimes against humanity and Israel's invasion and violation of Lebanese sovereignty, those people have every right to fight back. I'm curious your response to that.
I'm a stickler for definitions. And when people throw the word terrorism around, I go back to the definition. Using the definition of the settler colonial state of the United States, terrorism, according to the US legal code, is when you impose pressure on a civilian population in order to get a change in governmental policy. So any kind of pressure, any kind of harm directed against civilians to get a change in governmental policy. Hezbollah can never be called guilty of terrorism because Hezbollah's actions from the start, from the time it was created, have been directed against Israeli military forces or those aligned militarily with the Israeli military. And one can even argue further that an occupied population's resistance cannot be regarded as terrorism because they are fighting against occupation. So here it is just to recognize
and then on top of that, international law is on the side of the Palestinians.
Yeah. Versus the Israeli government is guilty of textbook terrorism. Textbook, trying to influence the Lebanese government to push certain aspects that now, of course, they have the president and the prime minister in the pocket of the US establishment. So just to acknowledge that, and a small correction, Israel actually began its pager attacks in Lebanon, its act of terrorism and its bombardment in year 1 of the Holocaust and not in year 2 of the Gaza Holocaust.
Okay.
And it's been ongoing. And very recently now, Israel has again declared that its ongoing occupation in southern Lebanon is going to be permanent. Which of course, this fits within the aspect of a settler colonial state, that it is an expansionist state. It is like a cancer that continues to grow unless it is excised from the body.
And can you talk to us a bit more about that and the murder of the now martyred former General Secretary of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, or Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, and how for post-colonial, from a post colonial Marxist perspective, or even just a post-colonial perspective, why his legacy is one that should be celebrated, and how do you assess his legacy? I'm very curious.
Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated September 27th of last year. It is a day that is a tragic day in our history. And he was assassinated with US-made bunker buster bombs with the blessing of the Harris-Biden administration in the United States. Bunker buster bombs that were decimated an entire neighborhood. How we look at his legacy, how to simplify it. I say this also as an individual who, when I was in Lebanon, I ran against Hezbollah in my run for Lebanese parliament. So I say this as somebody who had political disagreements with Hezbollah as a political party within Lebanon, because I wanted them to be leftist. I wanted them to
Yeah,
be revolutionary within the country. But when it comes to Hezbollah as an armed resistance, one cannot but acknowledge that the reason a people set up a resistance is because the state has failed to do so. If the state fulfills its responsibilities to the people and gets its army to defend the land, then there would not need to be a popular resistance. Hezbollah was born from the failure of the state of Lebanon to fulfill its obligation. And it has led heroic armed resistance in Lebanon, a heroic armed resistance that led to the liberation of Southern Lebanon, almost all of Southern Lebanon in May 2000, that led to later on the liberation of almost 20% of Lebanese lands from ISIS. Let us not forget that ISIS had been occupying and wanting to continue its invasion into Lebanon. And it was Hezbollah that protected Lebanese from ISIS and that liberated almost 20% of Lebanese lands from ISIS. Just like it was Hezbollah that protected Syrian churches within Syria from ISIS. So we recognize that regardless what one may think of anything. These are facts on the ground that
exactly.
cannot be negated. These are clear facts on the ground. Ma'lula in Syria was liberated by Hezbollah. And now look at what has happened to Syria. So how do we look at the legacy of a man, Hassan Nasrallah, who for generations, I mean, there are people of my age and older and younger, grew up listening to his speeches, grew up listening to his teachings, whether or not we agreed with them or not, they were present. And
Wow, that's
it's not, I mean,
that's quite something.
it would, you can tell I still have difficulty. He was an integral part of the Lebanese fabric of Lebanese society. Beloved, um, I would say beloved by every person who is dignified and honorable, both in Lebanon and beyond. And now we have this fight in Lebanon to hold on to the weaponry of Hezbollah because of the pressures that are being placed on the Lebanese government by the United States, the United States and Israel and all its other lackeys. And we do not have a president and a prime minister who has the rationale, the dignity, the honor to realize that if you disarm Hezbollah, then you open Lebanese borders. And the perfect example of this is the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, which was born out of the Oslo Agreement from 1993, the Palestinian Authority, which was built on the idea of military cooperation with the colonizer, the Palestinian Authority that after all
Acts as
of
a
these
colonial viceroy to
exactly after all
to
of
the
these acts of
occupation.
After all of these acts of surrender, after all of these acts of bowing down to the colonizer, did it result in the liberty of the West Bank? Did it result in the protection of the Palestinians in Nablus and Jenin and Ramallah? No, quite the contrary. We have that as an example. We don't want to look to Palestine? Let's look to the Syrian government, where we have suddenly Jolani, who of course was wanted by the Americans as a terrorist. Jolani, who it was a member of the you know hold on one second. I'm
Sure,
sorry.
sure, sure. No
Just
problem.
one second.
Oh, okay, Rania, continue with what you were saying.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, when we look at the Syrian government, since the fall of the Syrian government and the imposition of the US-backed Al-Qaeda Jolani regime, what has happened? Has this regime that has been imposed on Syria, that has openly called for normalization with Israel, openly said, we want to normalize with the enemy, has it resulted in peaceful relationships with Israel? Quite the contrary. The moment the Syrian government fell and we had the imposition of the Al-Qaeda Jolani regime in Damascus, what happened? Israel's occupation expanded into Syria and Israel's bombings of Syria increased. So we have the example in the West Bank, the example of the Palestinian Authority, we have the example of the Al-Qaeda regime in Syria. And so logically speaking, if the armed resistance in Lebanon were to be disarmed, what could we expect? Further Israeli invasions and occupations into Lebanon. It's just textbook.
Exactly.
So this is where we are right now.
And actually, I have to mention this when we talk about the legacy of Hassan Nasrallah. I remember the weekend he was murdered or martyred. The following Monday, my friend Eve Angler, frequent guest on this program, wonderful Canadian historian, media critic, and geocritic, outspoken anti-imperialist thinker and activist, who is running for the leadership of the NDP. When he talked about Nasrallah's murder in the comment sections of his live stream on Zoom, I commemorated Nasrallah and I actually expressed my condolences, my condolences to him. And many people in the audience expressed through emojis and the same sentiment, also expressed not just sadness, but outrage at his murder. So even amongst a large white Western audience, there was a lot of respect and solidarity to the late but forever immortal Nasrallah.
Yes. And let us remember that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was not the only leader of Hezbollah to be assassinated. The man who was then chosen right after him, who incidentally is his cousin, Hashim Safieddin, was also later assassinated. So an entire cadre of leadership, as well as, of course, 3,000 men, women, and children were injured and harmed by the Patriot terrorism attack by Israel. All of these things, by the way, were applauded in the US mainstream media and applauded by US bipartisan politicians from the Democrats and the Republicans.
Unbelievable. And you already mentioned, that's a perfect segue to this question. You already mentioned the new Lebanese presidents who ran on disarming Hezbollah, and the current Western Gulf puppets of Lebanon have vowed to disarm Hezbollah. Will this spark a new civil war in Lebanon, or not so much a civil war, but will we see a series of intense violence between the state and supporters and members of Hezbollah? What I mean by supporters is people who like you believe that Hezbollah is the only defense that Lebanon really has, and there are Lebanese communities who may not vote Hezbollah, may not even be members of Hezbollah, but they do support Hezbollah 100% when it comes to defense of Lebanese sovereignty and also defending the Palestinians. So will we see a lot of intense violence going on between supporters of Hezbollah against the states, a possible civil war? I'm very curious your response.
Just a small correction.
Sure.
Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, that's his title, did not actually run on disarming Hezbollah. He made other promises. He did not run on that campaign.
Okay.
But when he got to office, He then aligned himself with Nawaf Slim, who, terrible prime minister, and aligned himself with US interests to disarm. But it wasn't what he ran on. It wasn't, for those of us who knew him, we were not surprised, but it wasn't specifically his campaign. And for those who are not familiar with the Lebanese system, the Lebanese people get to elect parliament. The parliament then elects the president. There needs to be a quorum in the parliament. Once there's a quorum, they elect the president. The president then comes up with the ministerial cabinet, inclusive of the prime minister, and seeks approval of that cabinet by the parliament. So we don't directly vote for the president. If we would, there would be no way that Joseph Hound could possibly win. So just for that aspect, one other thing I would like to say is we have elections coming up soon in Lebanon, and we are expecting Hezbollah to win by a landslide. We are expecting that this time around, everyone who supports armed resistance, everyone who is opposed to what is happening in Lebanon will be voting for Hezbollah, regardless. So, if I were in Lebanon right now, that would be my vote. So it is, and of course, it's harder to vote overseas. So just to acknowledge that there are elections coming up, and let's see where it goes. In terms of what we can expect, I don't know. I don't like to make predictions to the future. What is already clear, though, is that the Lebanese state, through this prime minister and the president, have been increasing their level of state violence against protesters who are angry at what the Lebanese government is doing. And that does not bear well. That aspect of that level of violence does not bear well. Who knows? Will there be a civil war? Who knows? What will happen tomorrow? Who knows? But I cannot envision Hezbollah disarming. That cannot happen. That would be a surrender of the South. And we're asking people who Hezbollah leaders in Hezbollah recently stated
actually, sorry to interrupt. So do you think? Okay, so hypothetically, let's say Hezbollah did disarm. Did disarm. Do you think Israel would really be lunatic enough to be like, you know what, Southern Lebanon, it's now all ours, like what they did with the Golan Heights?
But why not? Why wouldn't they? I mean, let's remember Israel had been occupying the Golan Heights, and it expanded. So all of the Lebanese border with Syria right now is occupied by Israel. It expanded its occupation massively. Massive occupation of southern Syria right now, present by Israel. They're very close to Damascus. So why wouldn't they expand their occupation of Lebanon when they've already declared that their occupation of southern Lebanon is permanent? Why wouldn't they expand it further? Trump is talking about creating an economic free zone in southern Lebanon, economic free zone, which basically means we set up more kinds of what is that factory called? An economic free zone is a zone where there are no labor rights, there are no rights whatsoever, and that is what he wants to set up in the South.
Free trade, free trade.
It's not, and it's sweatshops. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. So it is a rational expectation to expect an expansion of the Israeli occupation were there not to be a Lebanese armed deterrent. So it's not as if we have a Lebanese army. Our Lebanese army is more akin to a police force. We don't even have functioning helicopters in the Lebanese army. Most police forces in the United States have more weaponry than the Lebanese army. And I'm not exaggerating, really. It is barely equipped. It is the Lebanese army is so poor that the Lebanese government does not even feed the soldiers themselves. They get their food from Qatar. So we are not really talking about an army that can defend the land and the people from an Israeli occupation. They have no defensive capabilities. They have barely any military training, and they do not have the weapons that they would need to have. Who does have those weapons are Hezbollah. And let us remember, at the very beginning, earlier this year, Hezbollah did give some of its weapons to the Lebanese army. And what did the Lebanese army do? They destroyed those weapons. They did not use them, they destroyed them. So let us be very
Wow.
clear as to what the vision is. We are not simply talking about the disarming of a militia. We are talking about the eradication of the backbone of a country in the face of an expansionist enemy, in the face of an enemy that has shown zero morality and zero humanity, that has been ongoing with no level of limitation, and that the world, in particularly Western powers, are giving them a blank card. And now, in the face of that horror, you ask us to relinquish our shield? So I cannot envisioning it happening. What could happen is the disintegration of the Lebanese army itself, because who would be asked to enforce the disarmament would be the Lebanese army. And of course, the Lebanese army, at the very least, would divide. The Lebanese army is a volunteer army. It's not a conscription army, which means those who primarily join the Lebanese army are those poor individuals who need that kind of very meager salary to maintain themselves and that meager kind of social security that the Lebanese army affords. Just like in
Wow.
The United States is a volunteer army. It's not a conscription army. And the frontline soldiers in the United States are disproportionately Black, Brown, and Native. First Nation communities and Black and Brown. And why have they joined the US Army? For employment, for a career path. So it's when we examine it that way, we see that the path that the Lebanese president and the Lebanese prime minister are taking the country on is a path of division, and it's a path of cowardice.
And I have to, going back to Palestine, but it's all but the plight of Palestinians is very much tied to the plight of the entire region when we talk about the Middle
Yes.
East and West Asia. What and despite a lot of the horrific stuff we see, and I think it's very easy to fall into first anger and then just depression with what we see going on in Palestine and what we see Israel and its backers, what it does to, your country of Lebanon, as well as Syria and the rest of the region. But where do you see, I guess, where do you find the hope in all of this? What sort of actions and mobilizations gives you hope that that the grave injustice that the Zionist entity is inflicting on your people, and I would say all of humanity as well as Western imperialism, it's not going to last forever, given, I don't know, the acts of solidarity that we see given to the Palestinians, or what's happening in the region itself. Very curious your response to that.
I mean, for me personally, I read Susan Abul Hawa. She is the individual who gives me the strength to go on every day. And I would encourage everyone to follow her speeches.
Okay.
But on a deeper level, I think the question of hope is a problematic one, because then it opens up the possibility that if we are hopeless, then we do nothing. And to me, we have two options, and these apply for us as people whose lands are being occupied and whose people are being genocided, as well as to people around the world who are suffering injustice, whatever form. We ultimately have two choices. We can be despondent, feel broken, and die, because if we do nothing, the injustice will continue and will expand. And for many of us, that translates into death. For
Mhm.
others, it translates into increased poverty, into increased denial of civil, political rights, But there's that option. It's not as if we do nothing, there will be a glimmer. We do nothing, things will get worse. We do something, there is a possibility. There's a possibility of liberation. There is a possibility of justice. To me, those are the choices, regardless of whether or not there is hope. It becomes secondary, It's which of these two should I want to do? And then if we opt with, okay, I reject the idea of despondency. I reject the idea of surrender, because surrender will not lead to anything but more horror. Then the question becomes, how do I resist? How do I organize? How do I strategize? How do I stand shoulder to shoulder with my comrades? How do I make sure that my work is not performative? that my work is significant. And these, I think, become the questions that we need to grapple with. How to do that, irrespective of whether or not we feel hopeful or not. That is not at all the question, because we are here today. How do we organize out of respect for the martyrs who have fought, out of respect for our children who will continue the fight, and out of just respect for our own sense of humanity? Because what happens also when we give up the fight is we give up our own sense of self.
Yeah.
And, that becomes a contradiction that for many of us becomes hard to live with.
It's September next month, and there's going to be I know there's going to be the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and very recently I was reading. I recently ordered a book of Juan Gonzalez, co-host of Democracy Now, who did a book about the environmental damage of 9/11,
Yes.
and a lot of the really horrendous environmental impacts, which the local governments of New York and the EPA, George W. Bush's EPA, did a lot of trying to, covering up just how bad the environmental damage was of the 9/11 attacks. And that's a perfect, and I wanted to, and talk to us about about, there, of course, there's the genocide we're seeing of people in the occupied territories in historic Palestine. But the environmental damage, I think, also doesn't get enough attention. Can you talk a little bit about just the sheer horrendous crimes against not just humanity, but against nature and ecosystem that we live in with what's happening with the genocide of the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza?
Fortunately, over the past few years, there has been a plethora of documentation of Zionist ecocide that they have implemented on the land. And I think it is perfectly natural for Zionists to behave this way, because what is the concept of Zionism? It is about supremacy, and it is a supremacy that is based on homogeneity. It
Mm-hmm.
is based on, people who belong to my religion and who pray in the manner that I find to be acceptable. We deem them to be supreme over all others. That same concept then reaches into one's regard of the land, reaches into one's regard of the trees and one's regard of non-human animals, as well as one's regard of human animals, of course. And we've seen that in the way that Zionism has transformed the land of Palestine, transformed it into a desert, transformed our native trees and removed our native trees and planted European pine trees at mass numbers, which then increases the possibility in the spread of fires because of the way that they're planted. We've seen them uproot olive trees because they have no connection to the land. And they see it in very ways similar to how the white settler in the United States came and practiced ecocide against the buffalo and exterminated the buffalo because they saw the strong relationship between First Nation communities and the buffalo. So therefore, they killed the buffalo to harm the indigenous communities. The same way we see the Israelis, the Jewish supremacists of the Zionist entity, destroy very recently tens of thousands of olive trees, remove them with a bulldozer, mass uprooting of olive trees because they know what the olive tree means to us. So of course, ecocide becomes a consequence. Just simply, how could an individual pour cement into a water well? Just think about what it takes for them to do that. And we're not even talking now about the destruction caused by the weaponry itself, the
Exactly.
destruction caused by the demolition of neighborhoods, the destruction caused by using white phosphorus, they very likely are using different kinds of nuclear weapons right now in Gaza, by the way, because bodies are evaporating. Bodies are evaporating. So we don't know what the consequences of this will be on the land, on the soil, on the water. But I find it all the ecocide that Israel has been doing for the past 7 to 8 years to be a natural consequence of Zionism, a natural consequence of supremacy, a natural consequence of settler colonialism, in very similar ways to what the white man did in the United States, to what the white man did in Australia.
shocked at, are you shocked at how silent the environmental movement, whatever that even is, or even eco-justice movement, how silent they have been in the face of what Israel is doing to the people of
No,
Palestine?
because the environmental movement as an environmental movement is by nature a supremacist movement.
Do
So,
tell, do tell.
okay, this idea of let us, if you, I'm tracing it in the United States, the idea of national parks. How did that arise? What's the history of national parks? What's the idea of I want to have a park and remove you, the indigenous community, from it? You know, because of course you don't know how to treat the land. We do, and we're going to put a fence around it. And by the way, then we're going to sell the trees at below market value, which is another thing that happens in national parks. You know,
Wow.
but
Yeah.
this concept of separating the people from the land, of only looking at the land as separate from people, which is traditionally what the Western environmental movement has been about, right? This concept of land and animals and then people somewhere else. Who deemed that separation? When did that become acceptable? When were we regarded as not animals? We are a human animal and there are other non-human animals. And historically, for centuries, we have coexisted with other beings, with the land, with the rivers, with the mountains. So once you remove us and you think about the land as separate from us, you're already starting a very problematic philosophy. So I would argue let's look at that. Let's look at that. Let's look at the Nature Conservancy in the United States and the way it works shoulder to shoulder with the US military. You know, looking at all of these lands that the US military has control over in the United States, and oh, we can make them into a natural hold on a sec. We have a problem with that here.
Wow.
We are still facing in North Carolina right now, we have communities, indigenous communities, that have been removed from their land by conservation easements. It's a conservation easement, so you are not allowed in. Hold on a second. You who have now been denied entry into this property have historically, for centuries, been coexisting with the river, and now you are to be forced out. Why? Because the one who's forcing you out doesn't have a coexisting relationship with the land, so cannot even imagine how you can belong. So just to acknowledge that from the start.
Wow.
I also,
Interesting.
you know,
Darkly
so,
interesting. Yeah.
but there is hope. I mean, when I look at Greta Thunberg, when I look at this young woman who began in the climate justice, that began as a climate activist, and never spoke about capitalism, never spoke about militarization. When she first arose, she was the golden child of mainstream press around the world, predominantly in Western countries, of course, loved by governments because she wasn't bringing up anything. And then she started talking about capitalism and militarization. And now she has gotten on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla to Gaza once, twice, and now a third time. So here we've seen the transformation. So can we make that transformation? Can we recognize that if we love the land, if we love the trees, let us understand what the land and the trees tell us. I say this as somebody who got her PhD in forestry.
Yeah.
You know, trees are amazing. And I say, if we as humans can emulate the mother tree, then we would have reached nirvana. If we can emulate mother trees are old trees in the forest that you look upon them above the land and they're very large, you know. And so from a capitalist individualist perspective, you would imagine that this tree hoards the nutrients underground, right? That the roots hoard, and that's how it stays strong because it controls everything. Quite the contrary. It has been discovered that these mother trees are givers of nutrients to other trees. They sustain other trees with their root system. They help communicate with other trees in the forest. They
It's
are
like a
the
vital
elder.
part of the yeah,
It,
part of
right.
the
But,
ecosystem ecosystem.
yeah, but in many communities, they are the elder who has the wisdom and the kindness and the compassion towards its community. That's what these mother trees are. They are the givers of knowledge and nutrients. Imagine if that's who we become, the givers of knowledge and nutrients, rather than the hoarders of resources. And when we look at it that way, then we see that the land has abundance and not scarcity. that the land does have enough for all of us if we share, if we share with kindness, not if we hoard from fear, but if we share from kindness. The land does have enough for us all.
Interesting. Then I have to ask you this question because you've been a professor in environmental studies for much of your life, and a couple of years ago I saw the documentary Planet of the Humans, which revealed that a lot of the green solutions to climate change aren't so green at all because they require a lot of mining. And with that said, I remember once back in my Democracy Now! Watching days, Democracy Now! Once did a report on how apparently climate scientists say we're past the tipping point, and many have been self-censoring their findings, saying that humanity is done for, but just don't want to say that in their publications. So to pursue green policies, even if do you think so I'm curious your response on that. And if the planet is truly done, do we still continue to pursue green policies even if it only gives the earth just a few decades to get to give its lungs more of a lifespan? Or are we ultimately terminally ill and there is no cure for the cancer that we've caused, Mother Nature and whatnots?
I think two things can be true at the same time.
Okay.
Scientifically, we have reached the tipping point. We have passed the tipping point. That was the case more than 10 years ago. At the same time, scientifically, there is much that we do not understand about this earth and about the way that it works. And we can hold both to be true. And we need to look at the land and the waters with that level of humility. There is a lot that we are still learning and still understanding. And at the same time, we have passed the tipping point when we look at climate change. Back in the 80s, if any of your listeners are that old, I remember in the 80s when folks were talking about that if we reach 150 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then it would be apocalyptic. We would be at 1.5 degrees Celsius in increase of temperature. This would be horror, blah, 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 all of the things that would happen. You know how much we have now, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
Do tell.
450 parts per million.
Okay, well.
If that doesn't cause like a physical contraction in our lungs, the lungs are I've been told this is where we store pain in our lungs. So it hurts to breathe. I have difficulty breathing when I read this information.
Yeah.
So yes, we are going to be facing, and we have already begun to face climate events that are historic. There's no question. Billions of people around the world will have their lands and their communities flooded. This is coming. What do we do about it becomes the question. Same way that I look at resistance. Okay, we can either do nothing or we can do something and there's a possibility. Any green policy must be built on a different economic system. There is no such thing as green capitalism. It simply does not exist.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying this as a socialist, I'm saying this as a scientist, because capitalism is built on infinite growth. The economy needs to continue to grow. We must continue to produce. This is what capitalism is built on. Well, that is a violation of the laws of thermodynamics. And those laws of thermodynamics are not plastic. They're not something that we can change with an election. So we hold on a second. We have a human-made system and we have the laws of the universe. Who's going to break? The laws of the universe are not going to break.
Yeah.
We have a finite system. We may learn to use items with more efficiency, but ultimately resources are finite. It is only sunshine that is infinite, but the lithium that we need to power solar power is finite. Ultimately, things are finite. The water is finite. The land is finite. So therefore, our economic system must take the limitations of this earth into focus. That must be the basis. I cannot spend more money than I have in the bank. Speaking just very simply, so we cannot build an economy and then think about the environment. The very first rule needs to be the limitations that our land and water provide, which this is ecological economics. So we need a different kind of economic system. And from that different kind of economic system, we can then build different communities and different politics and different ways of life, you know.
And
But there can be no civilization with capitalism. There simply cannot be. We are reaching that breaking point, you know. So what, where do we want to go? Yeah.
second to last question: Can we still love? Can we still live on this earth without going radically vegan? I'm curious.
Yes, 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 we can. And I think this idea that veganism is the only way, we need to look at where do you get your nutrients. There is a popularity now in the United States of lab-grown meat. You know, well, hold on, where are those resources coming from? What does it mean to eat local? What exactly are we eating and how are we growing it? If there is one book I would encourage folks to read, it is The Serviceberry. Let me pull it up so folks can see this. The Serviceberry. This
Okay,
this is the book that I'm in here. Pull up, you know, ignore like the bookmark. The Serviceberry is the book. This is a book that argues about abundance and how there is abundance in the earth, but we need to decrease our consumption. We need to change our way of life. We need to build a community. What does that mean? To build community, to restore the concept of mutual aid, to restore the concept of co-ops, to step away from constant consumption. And then there will be enough. But as we are currently functioning, no, there will not be enough, which means there will be an increase of poverty, there will be increased pandemics, there will be increased violence, there will be increased military borders, be they around, you know, private homes or around privatized cities. And there will be billions of people who will suffer. And I haven't even begun to talk about the insects and the birds and the plants and the mammals and the reptiles and the amphibians and all the other wondrous, wondrous beings that we should be grateful that we live on this earth alongside.
incredible. Well, uh, before we end the program, we usually end the program doing our questionnaire, which was first done by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and my hero, the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Rania, it's your turn to do this before you go.
Okay.
Starting off with, what is your favorite words?
My favorite word?
Yeah, favorite word, and it can be and it can be in Arabic. It can be in any language. So
Oh my God. I cannot have a favorite word. There are numerous words. And yes, I prefer Arabic to English when it comes to the to words and
okay, three favorite words. Then I can give you that.
the first word that comes to my mind is muqawami, which means resistance, and the root of the word. Um, I find great glory in the English word home and the different meanings in that word. Um, and a third word that you would like. Well, a word that I wake up with every day, which is simply Palestine.
I knew you were going to say that. I had a funny idea you were going to say that.
Yeah.
And that's
If your readers are really interested in etymology and Arabic language, I would also encourage you to read Sarah Aziz's book, The Hollow Half, which is a wonderful, wonderful, very poetic book.
okay. Then what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
The purring of my cat when my cat decides to give me some purring. I will say that. Yeah.
Then what is your least favorite words?
Liberal, neutrality, civilization. These are just really ugly, ugly words, you know, that have been used to cripple our backs.
Exactly. Then what turns you off then?
Though those are the words that turn me off, you know, those are it's those attitudes that I find to be problematic. And any kind of rejection of intersectionality I find to be deeply offensive also, you know. So yes.
Okay, then very curious. What's your favorite curse word then? And it can be in Arabic as well.
No, no. No, those are I like curse words, and I actually asked my students to do this one time when I was teaching. I said, okay, we're going to stop the class. I want you to think about a curse word that does not involve the act of sex and does not involve any human body parts. And you cannot insult the father, the mother, the sister, the brother. And there was this silence. And I find then to look at language as, to me, insults that are closer to descriptions, I find to be so much more fun. I'm not insulting, I am describing you,
Yeah.
and those I have a pleasure in. And I have to say that there is in our region in Lebanon and Syria and Palestine these wonderful insults that, may you be cursed with an illness that has no cure. May the doctor be blind that comes to cure. And it goes on and on and on. May the fever rack your body. They're so imaginative and visual that I just find them to be funny. I mean, just, like I can enjoy those.
That's, that's incredible. I'm gonna have to try to look up those expressions then.
Yeah.
What sound or noise do you love?
What noise do I love?
What sound or noise do you love?
Again, the purring of a cat. Oh my God. Or bird songs. Right now I say Ziad Rahbani's voice because we miss him since he passed. Yeah,
Okay. That's oh
you
okay.
know.
That's a good response.
Actually, and
Okay.
also the sound of wind and the rustle of the leaves,
Yeah.
because initially it sounds like water, but then we realize it's not water, it's actually wind and the rustle of the leaves. I find that to be magical.
Brilliant. Then what sound or noise do you absolutely dislike then?
Um, the voices of Zionists, anything
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they say, yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Netanyahu, but not just him. Like
Not just him.
just
Joe Biden,
yeah,
Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, AOC, all of these individuals who claim one thing and speak another.
yeah. And in fact, that's actually one of the reasons why I actively choose not to watch corporate media and so forth, and I actually go out of my way not to listen to whatever press conference Mark Carney or Justin Trudeau or any of those
Yeah,
politicians do
yeah.
because it just like, ugh, turns me off so much, gets me in such a bad mood. Then, what profession other than yours would you love to do? Would you like to attempt?
I would love to go back and be a teacher, and I would love to be a writer. Actually, I had dreamed of being a writer back when I was a child, and I would love to actually spend my days writing and teaching all the time.
But but when you talk about being a writer, like nonfiction or both fiction and nonfiction writing.
I think the line between fiction and nonfiction is really blurry, personally. So I would be blurring that line in my
Okay.
writing. But yeah, that would be a dream, and to have a bookstore where people can come in, get a good single malt, and read a good book. And of course, I would be the one who would be choosing the book, so there would be. But yeah, that would be very indulgent.
And then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Working in the slaughterhouse in industrial agriculture.
Oh I can imagine. And then final question, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God or Allah say when you arrive at the pearly gates or paradise? And even if you're an atheist, please do answer the question.
Hmm. I'm sorry. I would like the God to tell me that they are sorry, that they apologize. I'm sure that's going to sound blasphemous to religious people, but when I think of God, I am furious at the horrors that are being committed. And so yeah, an apology.
Spoken like a true atheist. It's always an atheist that actually gets a response like that.
I don't think I'm an atheist. I classify myself as an angry theist.
An angry
Uh,
theist. All
I
right.
do believe that there is more out there than I understand, that there very much could be divine, there could be supernatural. But when I think of the divine, I do not feel calm, I feel anger. And I have immense respect and even envy to those who are religious and who can actually pray and who do believe in an afterlife and who do believe that God will take care. I mean, I have respect and I envy them that calm. So it's it's not coming from the arrogance of Christopher Hitchens, but rather that from the envy of a cynic to a person of faith.
Well, you'll be happy to know when Robert De Niro was asked that question by James Lipton inside the Actors Studio, he said, "Well, if there is a God, he has a lot of explaining to do." So,
Yeah, that's how I feel. That's how I feel.
well, we are joined on this edition of One Plus One, our all things Middle East, West Asia episode, our all things historic Palestine and Lebanon episode with the always unapologetically outspoken and stupendous and wonderfully passionate and positively contagious Rania Masri.
Oh,
Let me
wow,
remind
thank you.
folks, let me
Thank you.
remind folks, Rania Masri is a Lebanese-American who has been a lifelong university teacher in environmental studies, and she is a lifelong anti-imperialist activist and speaker, all-round people power, eco-justice, social racial justice comrade and ally. Rania, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Thank you. You flatter me. You flatter me with those words.
I look forward to having you back on in the future. But until then, all of my best. And here's hoping from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Because if Palestine's not free, none of us are free. Not in Lebanon, not in Belgium, certainly not in Turtle Island and so forth. And I
Very
really do
true.
think that if Palestine fails, if the liberation of Palestine fails, I personally think it's game over for all of us. But we have to continue, and that's why we really do have to continue fighting for Palestine, for all of humanity. So
The liberation cannot fail because we may lose a battle, but this is not a war that can ever be lost. So if today we are losing this battle, but we will win the war of liberation.
and BDS now on Israel, and Ronnie again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, folks. Before we let you enjoy your weekend on One Plus One, Rania actually insisted that we do something because, anyways, Rania. So if God was so if you were to go to heaven and if you were to go to paradise and you were to meet Allah or God at the pearly gates, what would you say to him? Because you were expressing to me off the air that you have some regrets over the demanding of an apology and so forth. So.
I mean, yes, what I thought I would want would be an apology from the divine, but then the more I think about it, I don't know what I would feel if I were faced with the divine. I don't know if I would feel anger at the horrors that have happened on this earth under the divine's watch. I don't know if I would feel awe and humility if I would look at the divine like I look at a tree, an oak
Yeah,
tree that I'm amazed. I don't know. I don't know if I would ask, oh my God, I'm here in heaven. Could I go hang out with some of my heroes? And could I talk to Che? Because of course Che Guevara would be in heaven. I mean, of course, and could I hang out with Che Guevara and understand how he had the strength to build a state in Cuba? He didn't, I mean, just so I don't know. I don't know how I would feel. I don't know if I'd want to find out where the fundamental religious people are and go, yeah, 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 I made it up here, even though you thought I wouldn't. I mean, I don't know. I honestly, I don't know. But,
I
but
well,
you know,
well
so
this well that's your responsible take it. But I would but I would
you can
think
add that,
I
you can add that to it, like as an
would
addendum, like,
I'll just close by saying I think if there was you know God or Allah, as some people would like to say, and if he was this sort of social justice, compassionate firebrand, as some people believe this God to be, I think given all you've done for humanity, I think he would say, I welcome you with open arms, and Chen, all your heroes are just, around the corner. You just gotta take like a left over there or something like that. So
I mean, the Pope, the past Pope said that one doesn't have to be a believer of God to be welcomed by God into heaven. I'm paraphrasing, but
He
it
said
never
yes.
crossed my mind. I never once thought, if I don't do this and that, and if you know, if God does exist in the way that monotheistic religions claim that he exists, will he punish me by sending me to hell, and therefore should I believe in heaven? It never, that thinking just never was present to me. And I remember my father always telling me that Imam Ali said that if you believe in God um, out of envy for heaven, then you are a merchant, a trader. And if you believe in God out of fear of hell, then you are a coward. But if you believe in God out of love, then you are a believer. So, you know,
Interesting. Very interesting.
yeah, heaven and hell, I think are how we live our life on this earth. So if there is an afterlife and there is up on the seventh cloud, you know, it'll be interesting to see. I'm more worried about what's happening on this earth during my lifetime.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, until then, Rania, thank you so much for coming on the program,
Thank you. Thank you
and
so much. Thank you
all
so
my
much.
all my best until then.
Thank you. Thank you.